If you have had the strange feeling that reality has been quietly rearranging itself beneath your feet, do not dismiss that instinct. Something extraordinarily uncommon is approaching, and within the next 48 hours, a celestial pattern will reach exact perfection, one that has not appeared in more than a century. That statement is not meant to provoke fear or sensationalism. It reflects the extraordinary precision of what is unfolding overhead. The planetary architecture now taking shape is so exceptional that one of the most respected voices in modern astrology described it as the catalyst for a splendid relaunch of civilization. Pause for a moment and truly absorb the weight of those words. A relaunch suggests far more than gradual evolution. It points toward the rebuilding of the very systems through which humanity perceives reality, develops ideas, expresses creativity, and defines its place in the world. This is not simply another astrological season. It represents the beginning of an entirely different operating framework. On July 18th, Uranus traveling through Gemini reaches an exact trine with Pluto moving through Aquarius at 4 degrees and 29 minutes of their respective signs. The alignment becomes exact at 12:45 in the morning. At that precise instant, a gateway opens that humanity has not experienced since the early 1920s. The last time these planets occupied this same relationship, history accelerated in astonishing ways. Entire assumptions about existence were rewritten. Quantum mechanics emerged and forever transformed science. Radio broadcasting reshaped communication across the globe. Insulin entered human history and changed medicine forever. Discoveries that once seemed impossible suddenly became undeniable. Hidden realities stepped into public awareness. Today, that same celestial language returns, yet it does so within an age defined by digital systems, interconnected networks, and a growing understanding of quantum principles, making this cycle even more amplified than its predecessor. Yet the most remarkable part of this story remains largely overlooked. This exact trine is not functioning as an isolated event. It serves as the central pillar of an even larger celestial design. One so unusual that astrologers eventually gave the pattern its own distinct name. Without understanding the broader structure surrounding this moment, many people will completely overlook the 3 profound breakthroughs this configuration is preparing to reveal. Perhaps you have already noticed subtle changes within yourself. Maybe your thoughts have been arriving with unusual speed, as though your mind cannot organize them quickly enough. Perhaps ideas have appeared fully developed without the slow process of logical construction you normally depend upon. If that experience sounds familiar, there is a very specific astrological reason behind it, and the explanation only becomes clear after understanding everything that has been quietly unfolding throughout this month. None of this appeared unexpectedly. Moments like these never emerge from empty space. They develop gradually, each event preparing the conditions for the next until an invisible chain reaction finally reaches completion. The process leading toward July 18th actually began weeks ago, and every major transit since then has served as another link in the same unfolding sequence. The first spark arrived on July 4th. Whether you recognized it consciously or not, you almost certainly felt its presence in some form. Many people imagine that major cosmic events arrive suddenly without warning, but celestial evolution rarely works that way. Instead, planetary forces accumulate layer upon layer until the final alignment activates everything that came before it. On July the 4th, Mars united with Uranus at 3 degrees and 52 minutes of Gemini. Mars represents raw momentum, instinctive action, courage, separation, and the impulse that moves before reflection has the opportunity to intervene. Uranus represents disruption, innovation, unexpected awakenings, and breakthroughs capable of dismantling outdated paradigms in an instant. When those two planetary forces met, they generated extraordinary volatility, if your perspective shifted suddenly around that time. If a conversation unexpectedly changed your outlook, if an unforeseen event disrupted your assumptions, or if something inside you fractured open without explanation. That experience reflected the ignition point of the larger sequence now approaching completion. Yet the activation did not end with that conjunction. Within only a matter of hours, Mars formed a sextile with Neptune before continuing into a trine with Pluto. In doing so, it behaved like an electrical conductor, transmitting energy throughout the entire outer planetary system almost simultaneously. The original impact generated by the Uranus conjunction immediately became infused with spiritual vision through Neptune, while simultaneously anchoring itself into lasting structural transformation through Pluto. Long before most people recognized that anything significant had occurred, the deeper energetic framework had already begun reorganizing itself beneath the surface. Then the process shifted inward. On July 6th, the Sun squared Saturn, confronting individuals with undeniable realities, personal limitations, responsibilities, and truths that could no longer be avoided. Emotional optimism gave way to sober reflection. The following day, on July 7th, Neptune stationed retrograde at 4 degrees and 25 minutes of Aries, encouraging humanity to redirect attention away from external distractions and toward the inner landscape where genuine clarity is formed. Rather than searching outside for certainty, people were quietly invited to examine their own perceptions, motivations, and spiritual direction. That internal journey continued until July 12th, when the Sun reached an inferior conjunction with Mercury at 20 degrees and 42 minutes of Cancer. This alignment initiated a profound recalibration of the emotional mind itself, creating an opportunity for perception, memory, and feeling to reorganize around a new emotional truth. Then came the Cancer new moon on July 14th, serving as the final pause before everything became permanently interconnected. It resembled the deep inhalation that naturally occurs just before decisive movement begins. 2 days later, on July 15th, Uranus formed an exact sextile with Neptune at 4 degrees and 23 minutes of Gemini, establishing the visionary blueprint that now supports everything preparing to unfold. At that point, every essential piece of the celestial design had moved into position. Nothing remained accidental. Every angle, every degree, and every planetary relationship had become part of one precise architectural framework. Now fewer than 2 days remain before the portal reaches exact activation, and what enters through that opening carries the potential to redefine far more than individual experience. This moment cannot be understood as nothing more than a harmonious trine between two planets. Even standing alone, such a trine would deserve careful attention because of its rarity and transformative potential. Yet the reality unfolding now is considerably more sophisticated. The Uranus-Pluto trine functions as the central support within an exceptionally uncommon planetary arrangement known as a cradle, referred to by mundane astrologers as Barbo's basket. Understanding that greater pattern is essential, because it reveals why this event possesses such extraordinary significance, and it also prepares us for the deeper discoveries that the next stage of this unfolding story is about to reveal. At this very moment, an extraordinary pattern is quietly taking shape above us, one that is almost impossible to appreciate without stepping back and seeing the entire design rather than a single planetary movement. 4 of the outer planets that shape collective evolution, Jupiter, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, are all positioned at exactly 4 degrees within their respective signs. Pause for a moment and consider how extraordinary that level of precision truly is. These are not ordinary planetary bodies influencing daily moods or temporary circumstances. They represent the deepest evolutionary currents that redirect civilizations across generations. And now, each one occupies the very same degree, creating an intricate geometric structure that appears almost intentionally engineered. At the foundation of this remarkable pattern rests the exact trine between Uranus in Gemini and Pluto in Aquarius, allowing revolutionary change to move freely between these two air signs without resistance. This harmonious connection forms the base upon which everything else depends. Yet the real balancing point lies elsewhere. Positioned precisely between them is Neptune traveling through Aries, forming flawless sextiles with both Uranus and Pluto. Rather than acting as another isolated influence, Neptune becomes the spiritual center of gravity, the invisible point through which the energy of the entire configuration is interpreted and directed. Vision, inspiration, intuition, and imagination are no longer operating independently. They become the lens through which systemic transformation gains purpose and meaning. The design, however, is still incomplete without its final component. On July 20th, only 2 days after the Uranus and Pluto trine reaches perfection, Jupiter, moving through Leo, forms an exact opposition to Pluto in Aquarius at 4 degrees and 26 minutes. At first glance, an opposition appears to introduce conflict. It stretches energy between two opposing forces until the pressure becomes impossible to ignore. In this case, that tension develops between the sovereign expression of the individual represented by Jupiter in Leo and the immense collective structures symbolized by Pluto in Aquarius. It resembles the string of a bow drawn back to its fullest extension, storing enormous potential before release. Yet because Jupiter simultaneously participates in the harmonious web created by Uranus and Neptune through supportive sextiles and trines, that pressure never becomes destructive. Instead of breaking the system apart, the surrounding geometry absorbs and redirects the force. The opposition is held securely within the larger pattern. Rather than creating collapse, it generates momentum. Rather than producing chaos, it becomes a source of propulsion. This elegant containment is precisely why this arrangement attracted so much attention from the French astrologer André Barbol, who devoted decades to studying the mathematical relationships created by the outer planets. His work was not based on vague symbolism alone. He carefully analyzed long planetary cycles and successfully anticipated major historical developments, including the collapse of the Soviet Union and the timing of the pandemic period that unfolded during 2020, years before those events became reality. When his research brought him to the extraordinary alignments developing during the middle of 2026, he described this pattern as the most benefic planetary configuration of the entire century. His conclusion was astonishing. He believed this celestial architecture possessed the potential to initiate nothing less than a relaunch of civilization itself. That statement only becomes understandable once the full structure is viewed as a unified whole. The geometry is not simply beautiful. It functions as a container capable of directing immense transformational forces toward a coherent outcome. Inside that container, 3 profound breakthroughs are preparing to emerge, and for many people, they will arrive so naturally that they will not even recognize how dramatically reality has already begun to change. The first transformation is already unfolding within the human mind. Earlier, I mentioned that there is a specific reason your thinking may have felt different recently. This is where that answer begins. The most immediate effect of this planetary architecture appears within the realms governed by Gemini and Aquarius: communication, intelligence, learning, perception, and the exchange of information. Both signs belong to the element of air, emphasizing ideas, connection, and mental activity. When Uranus and Pluto establish a perfect trine across these signs, they are not merely influencing isolated events. They are quietly reshaping the framework through which consciousness organizes information itself. For many years, technological development has largely followed a centralized model. Artificial intelligence, data, communication systems, and digital infrastructure have increasingly concentrated within the hands of a relatively small number of powerful institutions and corporations. That pattern reflected Pluto's long journey through Capricorn, where hierarchy, institutional authority, centralized governance, and top-down control defined the dominant landscape. That era has now ended. Pluto has entered Aquarius, and this exact trine marks the irreversible point where the old framework begins giving way to something fundamentally different. The future indicated by this alignment points toward decentralized intelligence, open-source collaboration, peer-to-peer systems, and networks that cannot easily be dominated from any single center of authority. Uranus, traveling through Gemini, dramatically increases the speed and flexibility with which information circulates, while Pluto in Aquarius empowers the collective network itself rather than isolated institutions. Together, they do far more than introduce new technological tools. They alter humanity's relationship with knowledge itself. Information becomes increasingly distributed, interactive, and interconnected, changing not only what people know, but how they come to know it. There is another dimension to this process that may initially seem difficult to explain until it is personally experienced. The distinction separating biological thought from digital information begins to soften in unexpected ways. Gemini traditionally governs the nervous system, while Aquarius relates to frequencies, collective fields, and the invisible connections linking individuals across wider networks. As these planetary forces harmonize, they create conditions for breakthroughs in communication that extend beyond conventional language. You may already have encountered subtle hints of this transformation. Perhaps understanding appeared instantly without deliberate reasoning. Maybe an answer entered your awareness before the question had even fully formed. Perhaps ideas arrived complete rather than developing through familiar logical steps. Experiences like these are not necessarily random mental events. They reflect the earliest signals of the cognitive acceleration this trine encourages. The movement of information is beginning to exceed the nervous system's traditional habit of processing reality one step after another. That acceleration gently pushes humanity toward an entirely different mode of perception. Reality is increasingly interpreted through energetic patterns rather than strictly linear analysis. Understanding arises simultaneously from multiple directions instead of descending through rigid hierarchical structures. Many individuals will adapt to this new mental landscape almost effortlessly, hardly noticing that their internal operating system has already changed. That effortless adaptation reveals the subtle nature of a harmonious trine. Because its influence unfolds with remarkable ease, it rarely announces itself through obvious disruption. Instead, transformation quietly becomes the new normal before most people ever realize they have crossed into entirely unfamiliar territory, and that realization naturally prepares us for the next breakthrough waiting just beyond this remarkable configuration. Even though this new current of awareness can feel effortless, that does not mean it should be accepted without reflection. One of the greatest mistakes humanity can make during periods of rapid transformation is assuming that every emerging way of thinking deserves immediate trust simply because it feels exciting or inevitable. History repeatedly demonstrates that systems capable of causing harm often become accepted gradually, not through force alone, but because people stop questioning the assumptions shaping their perception. That is why discernment becomes just as important as inspiration during this portal. The energy moving through this alignment is genuine, its influence is powerful, and its potential is undeniable. Yet the true determining factor is not the existence of the energy itself. It is the quality of your awareness while engaging with it. Consciousness remains the deciding force. The choices you make, the motives behind your actions, and your willingness to examine what is unfolding inside you will ultimately determine how this extraordinary period becomes part of your own journey. If the first breakthrough seems centered on the evolution of the mind, the second reaches somewhere far more intimate. It touches the place where purpose is born, where courage is tested, and where the deepest motivations behind every action begin to transform. At the highest point of this remarkable celestial structure stands Neptune in Aries. This placement is not simply another planetary position within the configuration. It functions as the apex, the balancing point, and the spiritual lens through which every other planetary current must pass. Because of its location, Neptune quietly alters the character of the entire alignment. Aries has always represented beginnings, initiative, courage, and the willingness to step into unknown territory before certainty exists. It is cardinal fire, carrying the instinct to act, to lead, to pioneer, and to embrace movement before complete understanding arrives. Neptune, however, operates in an entirely different dimension. It softens boundaries, dissolves rigid definitions, expands consciousness beyond personal identity, and opens awareness to realities that cannot easily be measured or explained. It invites connection with the divine, the invisible, and the vast collective ocean of human consciousness that exists beneath ordinary perception. When these two forces unite at the focal point of such a rare planetary design, they produce a transformation far greater than simple inspiration. They begin rewriting humanity's understanding of courage itself. For generations, perhaps even thousands of years, courage has frequently been measured through conquest. The celebrated hero defeated an enemy. The successful leader dominated opponents. Strength became associated with control, power with superiority, and determination with the ability to impose one's will upon circumstances or other people. That reflected an older expression of Aries, one deeply connected with survival, competition, and the demands of the individual ego. This alignment introduces an entirely different expression of that same archetype. The hidden breakthrough emerging from Neptune's position is the gradual spiritualization of human will. In the reality now beginning to unfold, genuine influence will no longer belong primarily to those who speak the loudest, force their opinions most aggressively, or pursue dominance above everything else. Instead, the greatest power will increasingly belong to individuals whose actions arise from a profound inner alignment with their own soul. Their movement will not be fueled by anger, fear, insecurity, or the desire to control outcomes. It will emerge naturally because something far deeper than personal ambition is guiding them from within. You may already sense subtle evidence of this shift inside yourself. Motivations that once seemed compelling may suddenly feel strangely empty. The pressure to compete endlessly, the anxiety of being left behind, the constant need to prove your worth to others may no longer produce the same emotional urgency they once carried. That does not mean your passion has disappeared. Quite the opposite. It often signals that a more authentic source of purpose is quietly replacing those older motivations. Instead of chasing validation from the outside world, you begin recognizing an internal certainty that does not require applause to remain real. A quiet conviction gradually becomes stronger than external approval. This is Neptune, fulfilling its role at the apex of the configuration. It gently dissolves the ancient myth of the isolated conqueror, the self-made warrior whose value depends entirely upon victory, and introduces a far more enduring model. The new pioneer leads through devotion, not devotion to institutions, political movements, or rigid belief systems, but devotion to the sacred value of life itself. This distinction will become increasingly important, because it separates those who naturally move with the new current from those who continue struggling against it. Efforts lacking genuine spiritual integrity will gradually lose momentum. The signs of that process may already be visible. Projects built solely upon ego often begin encountering unexpected resistance. Individuals motivated exclusively by personal ambition without deeper alignment may discover that progress becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. This is not necessarily punishment, nor is it evidence of failure. Rather, it reflects a changing energetic environment. The frequency supporting collective evolution has shifted, and intentions rooted entirely in control no longer resonate with that emerging field. The older expression of the warrior sought victory through conquest. The new expression creates through conscious alignment. That transition naturally prepares the way for the third breakthrough, one that reaches beyond individual psychology into the larger structure of society itself. On July 20th, Exactly 2 days after the Uranus and Pluto trine reaches perfection, Jupiter forms an exact opposition with Pluto across the Leo and Aquarius axis. The intensity generated by this opposition is extraordinary because it concentrates opposing principles into one highly charged relationship. The resolution of that tension has the potential to influence how leadership, creativity, value, and collective purpose are understood throughout the remainder of this decade. One side of the opposition is represented by Pluto in Aquarius. This placement symbolizes the immense collective network, technological systems, algorithmic intelligence, and structures capable of organizing society through measurement, optimization, and increasingly sophisticated methods of managing information. When expressed without balance, this energy seeks to categorize everything, transform human complexity into statistics, and prioritize efficiency above individuality. Left entirely unchecked, such tendencies can gradually encourage conformity, surveillance, and the quiet erosion of personal uniqueness within an increasingly standardized collective. Facing that immense force stands Jupiter in Leo. Here lives the sovereign creator, the radiant spark of individual expression that refuses to surrender its authenticity. Leo does not simply seek existence, it seeks meaningful expression. It longs to create, to celebrate, to inspire, and to allow the human heart to shine without unnecessary restraint. This is the living source of creativity that cannot be reduced to numbers, formulas, or mechanical systems. The opposition between Jupiter and Pluto becomes the very cosmic bowstring introduced earlier, storing extraordinary potential within the tension between collective structures and individual creative sovereignty. And understanding how that tension ultimately resolves leads directly into the next stage of this unfolding story. When that immense tension finally finds its release, the force does not scatter randomly. It travels directly toward the structures that have defined collective power for more than a century. The transformation hidden within this alignment is not simply another economic adjustment or cultural trend. It signals the gradual weakening of anonymous institutional dominance while opening the way for the emergence of the sovereign creator on a scale that has never previously existed. The greatest influence during the closing years of the 2020s is unlikely to belong primarily to conventional corporations or established political organizations. Instead, influence increasingly gathers around individuals whose creativity, authenticity, and unmistakable personal identity allow them to connect with decentralized communities across the world. The center of gravity is shifting. Power is no longer moving from one institution into another, larger institution. It is flowing away from centralized systems and toward human beings themselves. The defining resource of this new landscape is no longer ownership of physical assets alone. It is the ability to generate authentic creative resonance that naturally attracts attention, trust, and meaningful connection. As this transition unfolds, the global economy gradually moves beyond transactions centered exclusively on material products. Increasingly, value begins circulating through authenticity, attention, originality, and energetic alignment between creators and those who resonate with their work. This has deeply personal implications. Activities that once appeared secondary, moments of joy, genuine playfulness, and uninhibited creative expression, can no longer be dismissed as optional pleasures reserved for spare time after responsibilities have been completed. Within the emerging paradigm, these qualities become central drivers of both economic opportunity and social evolution. The creations that arise naturally from sincere passion and authentic self-expression possess a kind of value that cannot easily be replicated through obligation or fear. By contrast, work produced solely because it feels required, expected, or socially demanded gradually loses the vitality needed to thrive in this changing environment. If you have recently sensed a widening distance between the path others expect you to follow and the direction your own heart continues urging you toward, this planetary opposition helps explain that growing discomfort. Jupiter facing Pluto across the Leo-Aquarius axis intensifies that internal contrast until it becomes impossible to ignore. Once the portal reaches full activation, the choice becomes increasingly clear. Will you continue surrendering your creative authority to systems that define your value from the outside, or will you step into the uncertain yet profoundly liberating experience of expressing your own sovereign creativity? No institution will make that decision on your behalf. The responsibility belongs entirely to you. Yet, before this extraordinary alignment is viewed only through the lens of optimism, another equally important dimension deserves careful attention. Every harmonious trine carries a subtle challenge, precisely because its energy encounters so little resistance. When transformational forces move with this degree of ease, the greatest danger rarely comes from external opposition. It comes from unconscious momentum. Because change unfolds so naturally, so convincingly, and with such apparent logic, there is a genuine possibility that humanity embraces revolutionary developments without pausing to examine their long-term consequences. New forms of artificial intelligence, rapidly evolving communication platforms, and increasingly sophisticated cognitive technologies may become integrated into daily life with remarkable smoothness. Their convenience may be so persuasive that very few people stop long enough to ask whether every advancement should automatically be accepted simply because it is possible. Uranus traveling through Gemini dramatically accelerates the introduction of new ideas, technologies, and methods of communication. That acceleration has the potential to overwhelm the collective nervous system itself. Information may become increasingly fragmented. Multiple algorithm-driven versions of reality may compete for attention. Artificially generated media could become so refined that distinguishing objective truth from convincing fabrication grows increasingly difficult. These possibilities are not presented as fear-based speculation. They represent the shadow expression of one of the most powerful air sign trines to occur within more than a century. The Jupiter-Pluto opposition, reaching exactness on July 20th, amplifies these challenges even further. Without conscious participation in the higher potential of the alignment, the same energy capable of inspiring extraordinary progress can instead descend into intense polarization. On one side stand technocratic systems strengthened by algorithmic authority. On the other stand powerful personalities demanding unquestioning loyalty through the force of individual influence. The balancing force, capable of preventing that outcome, arrives on July 19th through the Mars-Saturn sextile. This aspect serves as an essential stabilizing point within the larger sequence. It functions like a cosmic anchor, insisting that the brilliance, innovation, and rapid inspiration generated during the preceding days be translated into action that is disciplined, ethical, practical, and responsibly grounded. Without this stabilizing influence, the extraordinary ideas emerging through the portal risk dissolving into unrealistic idealism or accelerating technological experimentation without sufficient wisdom to guide it. The portal itself supplies extraordinary energy. The planetary geometry allows that energy to move with remarkable ease. Yet the ultimate outcome depends entirely upon human consciousness. The questions you continue asking, the assumptions you refuse to accept without examination, and the principles you choose to preserve become the deciding factors that determine whether this civilizational relaunch creates a future worthy of inhabiting. The next major turning point arrives 11 days after the Uranus-Pluto trine becomes exact. On July the 29th, a full moon in Aquarius at 6 degrees and 29 minutes stands opposite the Sun joined with Jupiter in Leo. This lunation becomes the emotional point of release for everything that has been developing throughout the month. Whatever quietly shifted during the portal, whether within your thinking, your relationships, or your understanding of personal purpose, This full moon brings those inner transformations into unmistakable awareness. Their consequences become visible. Their permanence becomes deeply felt. Whatever naturally fell away during this period is unlikely to return in its previous form. The ideas that entered your awareness are unlikely to disappear. For many people, awakening on July 30th may feel as though they have entered an unfamiliar version of their own life. The external world may appear remarkably similar, yet something fundamental within has been permanently reorganized. Previous fears lose much of their influence. Old patterns no longer seem compelling. Earlier definitions of possibility begin resembling memories from an existence that no longer reflects who they have become. Others may experience a quieter form of unease, not because destruction has occurred, but because authentic transformation always carries a certain emotional gravity. They recognize that an important chapter has quietly reached its conclusion, and the desire to return to former ways of living has simply disappeared. Not because returning is impossible, but because something deeper now calls them forward instead. This portal does not pause while waiting for permission. Its activation is already underway. The celestial architecture has reached completion. Every planetary angle occupies its intended position. The question has never been whether this alignment will influence your life. Its influence is already unfolding. The only remaining question concerns the manner in which you choose to meet it. Will you move through this extraordinary period with awareness, grounded intention, thoughtful discernment, and enough courage to release an outdated internal operating system while welcoming the one now beginning to emerge? The heavens have not displayed this exact configuration for well over 100 years, and they will not present it again within your lifetime. The choices made during these next 2 weeks carry significance that extends far beyond a temporary spiritual experience. They establish the foundation upon which the next chapter is built. The gateway is already open. Step forward with clear eyes, steady awareness, and a willingness to embrace what is truly unfolding before you. If you have remained here until this moment, thank you for sharing your time and attention. If this exploration has brought you value and you would like to continue following future insights, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support truly makes a difference. I also invite you to share your own reflections and experiences in the comments, because your perspective may resonate with someone else walking this same path. Until our next conversation, take good care of yourself, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.